Hey Slashaholics, be sure to subscribe to the channel, click that bell for notifications on all upcoming uploads, and be sure to smash that like button. And tonight's upload is brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page. That's Bonanza Jellybean, Bree, Carl Eakins, Cecilia Spears, Allison Sibe, Hawaii, Iron Alexa, Catherine McClear, Kai Antez, Ryan Woodward, Sean Campbell, and TikTok12. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel through Patreon. You guys are the reason the channel keeps going. And if anybody listening right now enjoys the content here on the 80 Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and would like to help the channel continue to go and grow for years to come, please take the time to head over to the Patreon page where you can sign up for as low as $2 to $5 per month. You help the channel keep growing because we're not able to monetize it here on YouTube because the copyright holders get all the ad revenue. So I depend on you listeners to take the time to sign up on Patreon. And I do offer some great rewards for you depending on the tier you select. Some of those rewards include early access content before it reaches YouTube, free slasher ebooks sent to you via email, free merch from the merch store, guest spots in upcoming narrations where you can voice a character in audiobooks monthly, and guest spots on the podcast, and much more. So just head over to Patreon, check it out, find the tier that's right for you to get the rewards you want and to support the channel. If you appreciate what I'm doing here on the channel, then I would greatly appreciate your support on Patreon.
You've seen you in your dream.
When I want you in my arms, when I want you, and all your charms, whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream. When I feel blue in the night and I need you to hold me tight. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream.
Just remember,
I can make you mine, taste your lips of wine, anytime, night or day. The only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm dreaming my life away. I need you so that I could die.
A Nightmare on Elm Street, the novelization. Chapter 8. Several hours later, Glenn's mother went upstairs to say goodnight to her son. She knocked gently on the bedroom door and called his name. There was no answer. "Glenn, are you all right?" Silence. "Glenn, honey." She waited a few seconds and then opened the door. Glenn was sprawled across the bed in front of the television set, his eyes shut tight, and rock music blaring through his stereo headphones. Mrs. Lance switched off the TV and the stereo before poking Glenn gently in the ribs with a loosely clenched fist. Glenn opened his eyes, yawned, and slipped off his headphones. "How can you watch TV and listen to the stereo at the same time?" asked his mother, smiling fondly at the sleepy teen. Glenn lazily returned his mother's smile and swung his long legs over the side of the bed. "I wasn't listening to the tube," he explained. "Just watching. Miss Nude America's supposed to be on tonight." "How are you going to hear what she says?" "Who cares what she says, Ma?" "Don't be such a smart guy," said Mrs. Lance. She gave the boy a playful swipe with the back of her hand. "You should get some sleep, Glenn. It's almost midnight. God knows we all need our rest after what's been going on around here lately." "I'll turn in soon, Mom. You and Dad going to bed now?" "Pretty soon," she said. "Get to sleep." She kissed the boy good night and left the room. Glenn waited until his mother had closed the bedroom door before turning the TV back on. He glanced at the clock. 11:42. Plenty of time before midnight, he thought, clamping the headphones back on and turning the stereo on loud. Then he lay back to rest his eyes for just a minute before heading off to Nancy's house. Across the street, a similar scene was being enacted at the Thompson home. Nancy was lying in bed while her mother busily gathered up empty coffee cups and boxes of No-Dos. "Get some sleep," said Marge, still a little tipsy, as she kissed Nancy tenderly on the forehead. "The nightmare's over, honey." Marge glared at the bars on the bedroom windows and felt strangely comforted. "Everything's going to be all right from now on." "Okay, Mom," said Nancy, barely able to keep her eyes open. Marge hesitated for a moment, then picked up the coffee pot from Nancy's night table and turned off the light. "Night-night," she whispered. Nancy closed her eyes and pulled the blanket up over her shoulders as her mother tiptoed out of the room and closed the door quietly behind her. 5 seconds later, Nancy's eyes snapped open. She jumped out of bed and took several deep breaths to fight off the sleep that felt like some powerful physical entity was trying to envelop her. Reaching under her night table, she found the full pot of coffee that she had stashed there earlier and poured some into the large mug she had hidden beneath her pillow. She rapidly drained the cup and then stepped over to the window. She opened it, pressed her face against the bars, and sucked in the cool night air. At that moment, Glenn's father was standing on his porch smoking one last cigarette before turning in for the night. He glanced up at Nancy's bedroom window and saw the girl's pale face just before she pulled down the shade. "You really shouldn't stare," said Mrs. Lance. Her husband crushed the cigarette butt under his shoe. "If you ask me," he said, still staring at the Thompson home, "that kid is some kind of lunatic." "You know you don't mean that," said Mrs. Lance. "If you mean the bars, that's just Marge being extra cautious. You know how jumpy she's been since Don moved out. Besides, with Nancy acting so nervous lately—" "All's I know," her husband interrupted, "is I don't want that strange girl hanging around with our boy any more." "Come to bed," said Mrs. Lance. She took her husband by the hand and pulled him gently toward the house. "It's almost midnight." Nancy looked at the clock on her night table and wondered what the hell was keeping Glenn. Across the street, Glenn was fast asleep, the headphones blasting loud music in his ears while the television flickered its colored lights in his face. He slept right through Miss Nude America and never even heard the telephone ring. Downstairs, his father had just turned off the lights. "Who the hell could be calling at this hour?" he demanded as his wife lifted the receiver to find out. "Hello? Hold on." She covered the mouthpiece. "It's her," she whispered. "She wants to speak to Glenn." "About what?" asked Mr. Lance, sounding very annoyed as he glanced at his watch. "What's this about, Nancy?" Mrs. Lance asked. She listened for a moment and then covered the mouthpiece with her hand again. "She says it's private. Very private and very important." "Give me that," said Mr. Lance, grabbing the receiver from his wife. "Glenn's asleep," he said. "Talk to him tomorrow." Without waiting for a reply, he slammed down the telephone. "You have to be firm with these kids," he told his wife. He glanced back at the phone and then took the receiver off the hook for good measure. "Now let's get some sleep," he said, feeling really in control for the first time that day. Nancy dialed Glenn's phone number again and got a busy signal. "Please don't be asleep," she whispered, staring helplessly out the window. Then the phone rang and Nancy snatched it up. "Glenn?" But all she heard was the horrible screeching sound of metal scraping against metal. Nancy slammed the phone down, a pulse now throbbing in her temples. In anger and frustration, she yanked hard on the phone, ripping it out of the wall. Brilliant, she thought, picking the phone up and dropping the useless instrument on her bed. Now what if Glenn tries to call? She stepped over to the window and stared helplessly at the house across the street. And then the phone rang again. Nancy whirled around and stared at the disconnected telephone as it rang a second time. Slowly, almost as though she were moving through water, Nancy reached out her hand and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she said.
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy,
said the triumphant voice of Fred Krueger. Before Nancy could say a word, the mouthpiece of the telephone suddenly turned into a mouth, its long, snaky tongue darting out and insinuating itself disgustingly between Nancy's parted lips. Nancy threw the phone down, smashing it into the wall. She stared at the obscene instrument in horror, still tasting the foul tongue in her mouth. And suddenly, the meaning of Fred Krueger's strange message became clear to her. "Glenn!" she screamed, running out of her room and down the stairs to the front door. "Locked," said her mother's slurred voice from the living room couch. "Locked, locked, locked. I locked it all up." There was a drunken smile on Marge's face. "You're going to sleep tonight if it kills you." "Give me the key, Mother," said Nancy, knowing even as she spoke that it was already too late. "Forget it." Marge took another swallow from the bottle at her side. "I don't even have it on me." There was no time to argue. Nancy ran to the back door. Locked! She tried each of the locked windows, shaking the bars in frustration and fury, but it was no use. Nancy was a prisoner in her own house, and there was no way to warn Glenn that the boogeyman was on his way. In his dream, Glenn thought he heard Nancy call his name. He had a vague notion of getting up and finding out what she wanted, but appearing on The Tonight Show and meeting Miss Nude America was a much more interesting prospect. He lay back on the sofa in the green room and waited patiently for Johnny Carson to introduce him. Glenn never noticed that the bed had begun to shake or that a foul aroma had begun to permeate the bedroom air. Had he been a lighter sleeper, Glenn might have woken up when Freddy's powerful arms first shot up from beneath the covers, grabbed him tight and pulled him deep into the bed, the stereo and the TV following close behind. Instead, Glenn continued to sleep as he clawed desperately at his blanket and sheets, trying with what little strength he had left to keep from being pulled still deeper into the abyss. But his efforts were too feeble and much too late. By the time Glenn began to struggle in earnest, the deadly blades of Freddy Krueger had already hacked and sliced their way through half a dozen of his vital organs. There was a moment of stillness, and then the bed began to bubble and gurgle like some obscene volcano about to erupt. Suddenly, a geyser of blood shot into the air, covering the walls and ceiling as the lifeless remains of Glenn Lance were vomited up from the center of the bed. A sickening mess of guts and brains and bones and shredded flesh, steaming over the edge like a river of gore. And then, when there was nothing left of Glenn to continue the dream, the pit in the middle of the bed closed up as if it had never been there at all. Mrs. Lance walked in a minute later to bring Glenn a fresh pillowcase. Even from across the street, Nancy could hear Mrs. Lance's anguished scream. Nancy was looking out the window when the ambulance and the police cars arrived. She saw her father climb out of the unmarked car that screeched to a halt in front of Glenn's house and waved to him from behind the bars. He returned the wave quickly and then hurried into the Lance's house. Nancy pulled down the window shade, went downstairs, and dialed Glenn's phone number. Chapter 9. Lieutenant Don Thompson was standing in the Lance living room a few minutes after midnight when the telephone rang. "It's your daughter," said Parker. "She says it's urgent." A look of annoyance passed over Thompson's face. "Tell her I'm not here," he said, watching the coroner head upstairs. "She saw you a minute ago," said Parker, his hand covering the mouthpiece. The lieutenant shrugged his shoulders and reached for the telephone. "Hi, honey." "I know what happened," she said, her voice strangely calm. "Then you know more than I do. I haven't even been upstairs, baby." "You know he's dead, though, right?" The lieutenant paused a moment and watched one of the uniformed men position a bucket in the middle of the living room floor. He looked up and saw blood dripping through the ceiling. "Yeah, apparently he's dead. How the hell did you know?" "Listen carefully," said Nancy, ignoring her father's questions. "I've got a proposition for you." "Go ahead," he said, only half listening as he watched the blood slowly drip into the bucket. "I'm going to get the guy who did it," said Nancy. "I'm going to get him and bring him to you. All you have to do is be there to arrest him, okay?" "You don't have to do anything, baby," said the lieutenant. He wondered if the breakup of his marriage had had anything to do with his daughter's mental collapse. "Just tell me who did it and I'll go get him." "Fred Krueger did, Daddy, and I'm the only one who can get him. Just come over here in exactly 20 minutes and break down the door. Can you do that?" "Sure, but midnight," said Nancy, glancing at her wristwatch. "That should be enough time for me to fall asleep and find him." "Okay, honey," said Thompson, wondering why in the hell Marge had decided to tell Nancy about Fred Krueger at a time like this. "You just get yourself some sleep, and everything'll be all right." "And you'll be there to catch him, right?" Before the lieutenant could reply, Parker appeared at the head of the stairs and reminded him that the coroner was waiting. "Don't worry, honey," he told Nancy, nodding to Parker. "I'll be there. You just get yourself some rest. Deal?" "Deal," said Nancy. "I love you, sweetheart." Thompson hung up the phone and began to head up the stairs. Suddenly he stopped and turned to Parker. "Go outside and watch my daughter's house," he said. "If you see anything funny, you let me know." "What do you mean, funny?" "I don't know," said the lieutenant, suddenly feeling a little foolish. "One thing's for sure, I don't want Nancy coming over here. She's too far gone to be able to handle anything like this." "I wish to God I didn't have to handle it myself," he thought, as he quickly climbed the stairs. Across the street, Nancy was hard at work, preparing to do battle. With her survival manual at her side, she began quickly to construct the weapons she would need to fight Freddy Krueger. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she carefully strung piano wire across the living room, filled a light bulb with powder from shotgun shells that Glenn had swiped from his father's gun case, and hinged the sledgehammer she had found in the cellar to a trigger mechanism over her bedroom door. Then, when she was finished setting her homemade booby traps, Nancy went upstairs and peeked into her mother's bedroom. Marge was lying in bed, the half-empty bottle of gin still at her side. "I guess I shouldn't have done it," she said, looking sadly at Nancy. "Just sleep, okay, Mom?" Nancy sat at her mother's side and took hold of her hand. "I just wanted to protect you," said Marge. "I didn't see how much you needed to know. You face things. That's your nature. That's your gift." Marge paused and looked at the bottle at her side. "But sometimes you have to turn away, too," she concluded, with a shrug of her slender shoulders. "I love you, Mom," said Nancy. "Oh, I love you, too," said Marge. Nancy pulled the covers up over her mother's shoulders and tiptoed out of the room. She went into her own room, crawled into bed, and set the alarm on her wristwatch to go off at exactly 12:30. "Okay, Krueger," she said as she closed her eyes. "We play on your court." Nancy was rummaging through the old furnace in the cellar. She pulled out the bundle of rags in which her mother had saved Freddy's glove and carefully unwrapped it. As she expected, the glove was gone. Nancy looked behind the furnace and noticed a door that she had never seen before. With only a moment's hesitation, she opened the door and began to descend the long staircase. She was startled when the door slammed shut behind her, but she knew that it would ultimately make no difference. Closed doors have no meaning in the world of dreams. Then she reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself once more in the vast boiler room. Nancy walked down the narrow passageway, the adrenaline pumping through her system, filling her with a sense of purpose that almost transcended her terror. "Krueger!" she screamed. "I'm here!" She continued along a series of treacherous catwalks, carefully avoiding the scalding hot pipes that surrounded her on all sides. It wasn't time to wake up yet. She paused a moment to catch her breath and noticed a familiar object, Tina's crucifix. She examined the crucifix for a moment and then continued her descent down a seemingly endless procession of ladders that brought her ever closer to the great roaring fire below. She was only a few yards from the fierce orange blaze when she almost stepped on Glenn's partially melted headphones. "Come out and show yourself, you bastard!" she shouted, her voice now indisputably that of the hunter and not the hunted. And then Freddy showed himself, more hideous than ever, with his head uncovered, his horribly scarred face transformed by the unspeakable hatred he felt for the girl who had dared to challenge his power. Without a moment's hesitation, he lashed out with his razor-sharp finger knives. But this time, Nancy was ready for him. She stepped back into the darkness, strangely confident that no harm could come to her as long as she avoided Freddy's deadly blades. She was falling now, but the scenery had abruptly changed. She crashed to the ground, no longer in the dank boiler room, but on her own front lawn. Nancy scrambled to her feet, knowing that if this had not been a dream, every bone in her body would have been crushed by the fall. Breathing the fresh night air, she ran toward the front door, eager to get back to the safety of her own bed. And then Kruger was behind her, an obscene chuckle of triumph welling up from somewhere deep in his throat. He swiped at Nancy with his blade, certain that she would be unable to open the door before feeling the wrath of his deadly glove. But Nancy attempted neither to open the door nor to flee from her attacker. Instead, she threw herself forward, grabbing Freddy around the middle and knocking him over on his back as she deftly avoided his lethal right hand. Then the alarm went off, and Nancy woke up. Still shaking and breathless, she looked around, almost disappointed not to find the man in the filthy sweater lying beside her in the bed. Of course she was glad to have escaped, but Nancy knew that the nightmares would not end until she finally succeeded in bringing Fred Kruger out of her dream. Bring him out of my dream, she thought, hearing as if for the first time the absurdity of the idea. I guess maybe I am crazy after all, she said aloud, remembering her last conversation with Glenn. Then Fred Kruger leaped at her from the side of the bed with an explosive scream of rage. Nancy rolled off the bed in time to avoid Freddy's claw and darted to the window. Searching desperately for a weapon, she grabbed her coffee pot and brought it crashing down on his head. He was still bellowing with rage as she dashed through the door and through the outside bolt, stopping for just a second to attach the string from the sledgehammer to the bedroom doorknob. Nancy raced downstairs and headed for the front door. Locked, she smashed the glass window and began screaming for help. Upstairs, the enraged madman had already discovered that walking through locked doors was no easy task outside of the world of dreams. His shoulders were strong, however, and it did not take him long to break the feeble latch that held shut Nancy's bedroom door. He threw the door open and stepped boldly out of the room. Instantly, he was struck hard in the chest by the full force of a 20-pound sledgehammer. Bellowing with pain and anger, Freddy stumbled out into the hallway and tripped over the fishing line Nancy had strung across the top of the staircase. He came crashing down the stairs, sprawling at Nancy's feet as she continued to scream for help through the broken window. And then Freddy was on his feet again, and Nancy was running to the living room, mocking and taunting the furious madman from behind the couch.
I'm gonna split you in two,
Freddy croaked, enraged by Nancy's courage and audacity. He took a step toward her, his finger knives held high, and tripped over the wire attached to the lamp in which Nancy had placed the powder-filled light bulb. As Freddy stumbled, the circuit was completed and a loud explosion sent him flying across the room. He lay on the floor, too stunned to move, while Nancy raced back to the front door. "Help!" she screamed. "I've got him trapped, Daddy! Where are you?" Jerry Parker looked at the girl from across the street and waved reassuringly to her. "Everything's under control," he shouted. "Get my father, you asshole!" Nancy shouted back, her outrage momentarily overtaking her fear. For a moment, she felt as if she had more control over the monstrous Freddy Krueger than she did over the moronic police officer across the street. Parker looked at the girl and then glanced at the house behind him. The last thing he needed was to have the lieutenant on his case. Better safe than sorry, he thought, as he went inside to report that Lieutenant Thompson's daughter was asking for him. Meanwhile, Freddy was back on his feet and hot in pursuit of the girl who had dared to defy him. Nancy fled to the cellar with Freddy only a few steps behind. Following the plan she had worked out in advance, Nancy hid behind the furnace and waited until Freddy's back was turned. Then she picked up the bottle of gasoline she had left on the steps and called his name. Freddy turned around and Nancy doused him with the highly flammable liquid.
No!
Screamed Freddy in horror as Nancy ignited an entire box of kitchen matches and threw the flaming box in his direction. It was too late to duck. Instantly, Freddy was enveloped in flame, screaming in agony that he had not felt since that horrible day 10 years prior, when he vowed to take his revenge on the people of Springwood. Nancy reached the top of the cellar stairs and stationed herself behind the door just seconds before the flaming madman started to follow. He was about to pull open the door when Nancy suddenly pushed it forward with all of her strength, knocking him down the stairs with a terrible crash. She barely had enough time to throw the deadbolt on the cellar door before she heard Freddy charging back up the stairs. She arrived at the front door just as her father stepped out onto Glenn's porch across the street. "Daddy!" she screamed. "I did it! Please hurry!" Lieutenant Thompson saw the look of urgency on his daughter's face and called to a few of the uniformed patrolmen for help. Together, the men quickly broke down the locked door and rushed into the home. Nancy threw herself into her father's arms as Parker and the others raced toward the smoking cellar. "What the hell is going on?" asked the lieutenant. Nancy was about to explain when she noticed the trail of flaming footsteps that led from the cellar door, across the living room carpet, and up the front stairs. "He's after Mother!" Nancy shouted, dashing up the stairs, with her father close behind. She arrived at Marge's bedroom to find her mother pinned to the bed by the still flaming Freddy Krueger. Without a moment's hesitation, Nancy picked up a chair and brought it crashing down over the fiery monster's head. Freddy fell to one side just as the lieutenant entered the room and threw a heavy blanket over the burning bed. "Watch it!" screamed Nancy. "He's under there!" Immediately, the lieutenant yanked the top cover off the bed. The fire was out, but the bed continued to glow with an eerie reddish light. In its center lay the charred corpse of Marge Thompson, smoking and seething as it sank slowly into the mattress, its gnarled and blackened hand waving a gruesome farewell. Then the glow faded, and the hole that had become Marge's eternal grave closed up forever. "Now do you believe me?" asked Nancy, a strange calm descending on her as she looked her father in the eye. Before the lieutenant could reply, Parker burst in to report that the fire downstairs was under control. Don Thompson looked at his daughter, but could find no words to express what he was feeling. "I'm okay," she said, knowing that the nightmare was rapidly approaching its inevitable end. "You go downstairs. I'll be there in a minute." The lieutenant hesitated for a moment, and then left the room, closing the door behind him. Nancy turned her back to the bed and waited. Slowly, the figure of Fred Krueger rose, ghost-like, from the center of the mattress. "I know you're there, Freddy," said Nancy, turning to face the charred monster.
You thought you was gonna get away from me?
He croaked, surprised by the calmness of her voice. "I know you too well now, Freddy," Nancy replied. Freddy grinned, confident that the chase was over at last.
And now you die,
he said, his gleaming steel talons poised to strike one more time. But Nancy just looked at him and shook her head. "It's too late, Krueger. I know the secret now. This is just a dream. You're not alive. It's only a dream." She paused to let her words sink in, and then took a deep breath. "I want my mother and my friends again," she said.
You what?
The madman bellowed. "I take back every bit of energy I ever gave you," said Nancy quickly, turning her back on Fred Krueger for the last time as she walked slowly toward the bedroom door. "You're nothing, Krueger," she said calmly. "You're shit." Freddy stepped behind her, his fingerknives bunched together and poised over the back of her neck. Nancy took another deep breath and reached for the doorknob as the deadly steel talons began to come down. And then... Chapter 10. And then it was morning. Nancy stepped outside into a beautiful new day and squinted at the blinding sunlight. "God, it's bright," she said, shading her eyes with her hand. It's gonna burn off soon," said Marge Thompson, stepping out of the house right behind her daughter. "Otherwise it wouldn't be so bright. The sun's just trying hard." Nancy looked at her mother and smiled. She had a vague sense of something having been wrong the night before, but it was impossible to think about unpleasant things on a magnificent morning like this. "Feeling better?" Nancy asked. "I feel like $1,000,000, said her mother, and Nancy thought she looked it. "They say you bottom out when you can't remember the night before." She paused and slowly nodded her head as if making an important decision. "No more drinking for me, baby. I just don't seem to like it any more." She turned and looked at Nancy. "I kept you up last night, didn't I? You look a little peaked." "I guess I just slept heavy," said Nancy, vaguely recalling some unpleasant dream that might have disturbed her sleep. Before she could give the matter any more thought, however, a red convertible with its top down pulled up to the curb in front of the house. Glenn Lance was at the wheel as usual, while Tina Gray and Rod Lane held hands in the back seat. "You believe this fog?" Glenn called out to Nancy's mother as Nancy climbed into the front seat of the convertible. "I believe anything's possible," said Marge with a cheerful laugh as she waved goodbye to Nancy and her friends. Glenn was about to drive off when the top of the convertible suddenly clamped down like a sprung trap. "What are you doing?" asked Rod. "I'm not doing anything," said Glenn, and it was true. It wasn't he who had closed the top, or shut all the windows, or locked all the doors, or painted the weird red and green stripes on the convertible top. "Mother!" screamed Nancy, but Marge never heard her daughter's screams of terror as the demon automobile drove itself away and disappeared into the fog. Nancy's mother was still smiling and waving from the doorway when a talon-tipped hand suddenly shattered the glass window behind her, grabbed Marge by the throat, and yanked her back into the house with superhuman strength. Perhaps it wasn't going to be such a wonderful day on Elm Street after all. The end. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been A Nightmare on Elm Street, the novelization of the first film. And wow, I gotta say, I really enjoyed it, although it was pretty short compared to other novelizations, and it stayed really true to the movie. It was still a really entertaining read that had me wanting to get back to it quickly. And I hope you guys enjoyed it too. What I really love about the first Elm Street is how Freddy, and don't get me wrong, I love voicing Freddy, it's a lot of fun, but I really enjoy how he's not really the campy, talkative guy he is in the later movies, and he's more terrifying in this one. And I love the part of the first movie at the end where you're like, okay, was the whole movie a dream? Is this a dream? Is the dream still going? Is it not over? Are they all dead? Are they all about to die? I love that ambiguity of it, you know? And I'm glad that the novelization didn't change any of that. And I'm kind of glad it wasn't different, to be honest with you, because I always thought the first Elm Street was perfect. And I really enjoyed narrating it and bringing it to you guys. I'm going to narrate part 2, 3, 4, and 5 as well, but I'm going to skip Freddy's Revenge for now, and I'm going to be doing Dream Warriors pretty soon. If you're listening to this far, you know, away from the upload date, then by then I've probably already done Freddy's Revenge and all of them. But if you're listening to this pretty close to, you know, March 24th when I'm uploading it, then yeah, I'll be doing Dream Warriors before I do Freddy's Revenge. And I've heard that it's a lot different than the movie, so I'm looking forward to that big time. But yeah, guys, wow, I really hope you guys enjoyed it. There's not a whole lot more I can say about it. I said a lot in the individual uploads at the ends of the chapters. I like the writing. We didn't get a whole lot of extra stuff, but that's okay because you really just can't mess with perfection, and the first movie was perfection. The novelization of it stayed true to it. I really enjoyed it. Freddy's a lot more terrifying in the first movie and in this novelization. But I'd love to hear from you guys in the comment section below. Let me know what you thought of the book, and if you're looking forward to the other novelizations. There was actually only 2 books written of the novelizations, as you can see on the screen there, the cover. One book has parts 1, 2, and 3. The other one has 4 and 5. But I didn't want to put 1, 2, and 3 all in one unabridged upload. I want to split them up into their own. That's why I did this one separately, and I'll do 2 and separately, 3 separately. And I think you guys will enjoy it more that way. I know I will. And yeah, I'll be back very soon with more slasher mayhem here on the 80s Slasher Librarian YouTube channel. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening, be safe, and
Pleasant dreams!